So I would like to present the series Being a Leader, Lunchtime Conversations. The series offers opportunities to reflect with organizational and community leaders around the challenges of social transformation in a complex world, and to better appreciate the resources we can rely on to act within this world. It is organized by the Providence School of Transformative Leadership and Spirituality at St. Paul University. So I would like to share with you a few reminders before we start. As you notice, this conversation will be recorded and added to our YouTube channel. We will be sending out the link after the event so you can access this conversation. We also invite you to keep your webcams open if possible, and don't hesitate to send your questions or reflections throughout the interview using the chat. We will have some time at the end of the interview for questions and answers following the conversation with our invited leader. So I will now, it is my pleasure to invite my colleague Lauren Michelle Levesque to present our speaker for this afternoon. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I have the pleasure of welcoming you here to our final Being a Leader lunchtime chat for the 2021-2022 academic year. I'm an assistant professor in the Providence School of Transformative Leadership and Spirituality, and I am the incoming director of the school. So I also have the pleasure of welcoming our guest for today, Karri Munn-Venn. And I'll give you a very short bio before I ask her to go ahead and say a little bit more about how she came to work for the organization where she's at right now, CPJ. Karri is the Senior Policy Analyst at Citizens for Public Justice, a national organization of members inspired by faith to act for justice in Canadian public policy. She's also an artisan and a farmer, and she lives with her fabulous family at Fermes Leystone Farms in West Québec. So, as I mentioned, this is a very short bio. So my first question for Karri is, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about yourself, including how you came to your current position at CPJ.
Sure, thanks so much. I first want to acknowledge that I have the privilege of joining from unceded Algonquin, Omami, Winiwag, and Anishinaabe territory in West Quebec. And it's a delight to be here, and it's a delight to be with all of you this morning. I saved some reservations perhaps for Mr. Joe Gunn, but glad to see you all. I have been at Citizens for Public Justice, which, as Lauren said, is a national organization of members inspired by faith to act for justice in Canadian public policy for just about 14 years now. And I came to this role with a background in international development and a keen interest in exploring essentially and kind of fundamentally how we could work to make the world a better place. I joined CPJ when my first two children were very small, and I had become increasingly cognizant of some of the challenges that we face right here in Canada. And that really motivated me to come into the organization. And I think an important piece of it too is that a lot of my work had been motivated by my faith, by my spirituality, by a belief that we as human beings were invited into in work of healing and work of justice. But it was always kind of in the background, like I kind of left that at the door. And when I learned of the opportunity at CPJ, it was a really interesting situation where we were invited to kind of lead from a faith-based perspective and to come into social justice issues that way. I will mention really briefly for those of you who may not know CPJ, we grew out of a Christian Reform tradition, but over the years have become much more ecumenical and embraced a much wider range of perspectives and life experiences. And our three main policy issues are eradicating poverty in Canada, achieving a more fulsome welcome for refugees and migrants in Canada, and climate justice. And it's the third area where I take primary responsibility.
Great, thank you so much for expanding out some of the reasons why you have ended up doing this important work. In our conversation in preparation for this interview, we discussed a range of questions. It was a lovely conversation, a good chat for over an hour, actually. We discussed questions such as how do we find meaning and purpose as leaders in the midst of the current climate crisis? How does spirituality constructively inform climate justice policy? And we also talked a lot about the idea of interconnectedness and how that can help to be a bridge between theory, for example, theory and practice. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about how you understand, given that series of questions and your work at CPJ, how you understand leadership. And you said a little bit about what's motivated you for, or your work for social justice and climate, social and climate justice work. So maybe how your understanding of leadership has helped to influence your work in these areas.
Thank you. And my apologies. I'd warned the organizers ahead of time that I have a dog that can sometimes be a little loud, and those who are called to intervene have not stepped out yet.
Speaking of interconnectedness, I think we all have experiences of that these days as we are emerging from the pandemic and out of working from home. So I'm back in my office, but I have definitely had that experience of dogs barking, cats walking in front of screens, et cetera, et cetera. So Karri, I'll give the floor back to you.
Thank you, and my apologies. I think questions of leadership, I think, are really interesting. To my mind, often we attribute leadership to a particular position or a title, and that can be a really important part of it. But I actually think true leadership is more about what we do, how we behave, and the kind of example we offer for others, more than it has to do with any particular title or the role that we might hold. And in the context of climate justice, I think particularly of youth and Indigenous leaders who aren't leading in the sense of necessarily being at the head of an organization or, you know, with a particular salary or anything like that, but they are leading out of passion and conviction, and a real profound care that I think adds a layer of authenticity and also just integrity, I think, to their leadership, because they're not, because it's something that they're just doing. It's not that a title has been bestowed upon them and therefore they do A, B, and C. The other piece that I think is really important, though, is that I think fundamentally, I choose to believe in the goodness of people and the good intentions of people. And in my work in advocacy, which has me regularly interacting with politicians and senior civil servants and others, I choose to believe that regardless of political stripe or policy position, that people in positions of leadership, and I'd say this applies to clergy in different denominations as well, fundamentally are doing the work that they're doing because they feel called to do something to make a contribution in the world. And I find that really helpful in dialogue and in conversation, because if we choose to believe the sort of the intentions of our leaders are good, then that opens the dialogue in a different way. but also it's something that I kind of came to, having spent some time being really intimidated by the idea of speaking with political leaders, cabinet ministers, and others, for example, realizing actually that they're not that. At the end of the day, we're all human beings trying to do the best that we can. And some of us have more responsibility, some of us have more of a public profile, but meeting leaders as other humans, I think, has been something that adds, I think adds, again, a sincerity and authenticity to something that might also otherwise be a little bit where there might not, or whether it's be more barriers.
It's interesting that you bring up these concepts of integrity and authenticity, and those are concepts that or qualities that come up quite a bit in conversations that I have with students or around leadership. So just a quick follow-up question: if you could say a bit more about how you understand those concepts and how you feel you're able to engage with them as a policy analyst.
I think fundamentally it's about walking the talk, you know, and this is something actually that at CPJ we've just come through a really interesting process that in many ways puts us at a starting point for something. And that's that we've just recently released an equity and anti-oppression statement. And as part of that, we're now working on, we're looking at how do these commitments that we've made inform our strategic plan and all of our day-to-day decision-making. And it's interesting because I think that throughout my experience, and I think even beyond that at CPJ, there's been an interest and a sort of a underlying current that in our understanding of justice that we're looking to seek equity and to be anti-oppressive and all of that. But it's also, there's real value in naming it. And part of that is that it provides another way in which we can explore what we're doing internally and the way we interact with one another and with the communities with whom we work and on whose behalf we often advocate in a way that provides more clarity and transparency. And it's because, and I think a lot of it was informed by, you know, as a public policy organization that is constantly, we've got all kinds of ideas on what we think federal government should do and different ways that policies should be implemented and the implications of those. But it was really important to formalize that element of sort of introspection and sort of and holding the mirror up to ourselves as well to ensure that we were doing within CPJ all the things we were calling for more broadly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great concrete example. So in line with that, I was wondering if you could, we talked a little bit about leadership, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you understand spirituality. Since you work at CPJ as a faith-based organization, you've mentioned that. So how does your understanding of spirituality shape or influence your work?
There, he was quiet all morning.
He knows he knows it's being recorded.
Yeah, that's right. He knows there's a microphone nearby. I often joke that it seems to make perfect sense that I ended up working for an ecumenical organization. I was raised in the Presbyterian church by a strict Baptist woman. When I was a kid, I would actually sometimes say I was Presbyterian first and Baptist second and Catholic third, not understanding the distinctions between the different theologies and perspectives. And yet, ultimately, I spent many years in the Anglican Church as well. But ultimately, I think there are pieces of all of the different theologies and approaches that have informed the way I see spirituality, the way I understand faith. And more recently, I think I've come to learn more about Indigenous spirituality And that has been profoundly informative, and there's been a resonance in that. You mentioned off the top some of the conversation we had about interconnectedness, and really realizing how all of the pieces, everything that we do, the decisions that we make, it all fits together in one way or another. And I think that that's, when we choose to listen, that's something that does come from the teachings of Indigenous spirituality. And closely related to that actually is love. And a lot of the way that I think that we approach our work is in seeking to care for the created world and for one another. And that can seem a little bit distant from, a public policy approach, but ultimately it's about trying to shape the decisions that will inform the ways people live and the impacts that we have on the planet. And when we do that, rooted in genuine care and compassion and love, I think that's an important way to approach it. It's certainly been really important to me.
So you just mentioned something that about this idea that these experiences of care and listening and love as being something that we might not necessarily put in the same the same container as we're doing public policy. So I'm just curious about whether you can talk a little bit about what it looks like to work out of those frames of reference, not only as a faith-based and ecumenical organization, but also, trying to bring these experiences and frameworks into a public policy in a meaningful way.
Often when I do workshops or discussions, they used to be in church basements, now they're usually on Zoom. I'll start with an activity that we've referred to as begin with the place you love. And this may actually have been an idea that Joe shared with me years ago, but I've worked with it for so many years now that I've kind of adopted it as my own. But it really is based on the premise that when we look at creation care or climate justice and climate advocacy, everyone has that place somewhere, whether it's, your cottage or your grandmother's farm or a summer camp or something where you found yourself probably pretty early in life just feeling a tremendous sense of awe and wonder. And if we can connect with those places and remember that we have those places, then that can serve to motivate action to protect those places. And in terms of how that feeds public policy, it comes back to the issue of interconnectedness. We can't, we sometimes, and I think one of the things that I've worked to challenge a little bit in the last few years is that nature is seen as a space uniquely reserved for leisure. And yet it is fundamental to our existence, to life on the planet, right? So it's not just the places that we go to hike or to swim or to fish or whatever, but it's, it's the source of our food. It's the source of clean air. It's what sustains us. And so being mindful of that reality, and also, my focus is on climate. So that's kind of where my mind goes. But just all of the ways that we do things and how that impacts other people, whether it's people in our community, people in the global south, that there is a place for all of that mindfulness and reflection in public policy. And I actually think that the more of that is present as public policy is being developed, the more effective it will be in supporting the common good and lifting people up and sustaining the planet.
Great, thank you so much. This idea of interconnectedness, I realize I mentioned it at the beginning of our conversation, but it also came up in our previous conversation as we were preparing for the interview. And I asked you about the relationship between theory and practice, and how interconnectedness can be a bridge to bring those two dimensions of your work or other climate justice work together. And you had some thoughtful reflections on this relationship between interconnectedness theory and practice. So I was wondering if you could share some of those reflections for our audience today.
For sure. Yeah, and this is one I find really interesting, because a lot of my engagement with climate policy for a long time was fairly academic. I read the reports, I was aware of the policies, and quite frankly, that had become very heavy. I remember a time before the pandemic that I was at home with a sick kid and reading it was probably, well, I can't remember which research it was, but some research about the impacts of climate change and what was going on. And I actually had to put it aside because I couldn't really bring that in all its fullness while looking at my child, who was then probably about 7 years old. Like it was just really, really heavy. So I realized that I needed to find ways to manage that. And so then fast forward a little while, 2 years ago, this week, actually, we moved our family from sort of suburban Ottawa to 25 acres in West Quebec, where we've started farming. And I'm actually in the process now of actually shifting to the farm full time. So just occurred to me, this may actually be my last public presentation as a CPJ policy analyst. So thank you for that. But what's been fascinating to me is that as I've spent time, whether it's collecting eggs or pruning plants or moving manure, I've found a groundedness in my interaction with the natural world that has really helped immensely, way more than I ever could have imagined, in approaching the issue of climate justice and so many of the challenges we're in this interesting tension right now where our federal government is doing more than has ever been done before, and yet it's fundamentally inadequate. Like, we're just nowhere near where we need to be. And that's still a difficult tension to sit in, but there's something about remaining grounded and connected with natural processes that really, I think, help to better inform the kinds of conversations I'm able to have around climate policy, and also, quite frankly, support my mental health. And it's interesting because I've tried to figure it out. I know that, growing great, big, beautiful pumpkins from a tiny little plant, and, even the small practices of regenerative agriculture where we have livestock in growing areas and things like that, that's not going to solve the crisis that we're up against. But I think it allows me to engage more fully and more wholeheartedly in the work of pushing for policy to achieve climate justice in a way that I wasn't able to do when all I experienced was the weight and the heaviness of it all. So It's I don't know, I think I said it when we spoke earlier, I don't know that that's necessarily an immediately transferable piece for others in terms of bringing together theory and practice. But I do think, one of the things in the Ottawa area is that we are graced with so many wonderful outdoor spaces, so that it doesn't necessarily have to be in farming, but if you plant flowers in your own garden, or to be present to that and to realize the power and the strength of engaging with nature and the creative world.
So thank you for that, and it leads into actually nicely to my next question, which had to do with practical advice you would give emerging leaders and or activists who were interested in getting into social and climate justice. But I also want to link it back to something you said earlier in our conversation about this idea of needing to staying positive. And of this intrinsic belief in the goodness of other people, which I think can be a challenging space to sit in our very polarized and uncertain certain times, that with the uncertain times that we're living in right now. So with that in mind, what practical advice would you give now, as well as you're moving out of your policy analyst role and into this new, well, I wouldn't necessarily say new, but fairly new initiative in your own life?
Yeah, I should start with full disclosure. I don't always succeed in holding that belief around the goodness. I know it, but there are moments, of course, where it is challenged and we shake our heads and wonder, what are they thinking? How could they choose to do that? But so that's a work in progress. I think the other one, the piece in terms of practical advice, there's a beautiful exercise that the marine biologist, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson out of the United States developed. It's super simple in terms of a series of Venn diagrams. And people that know me know, I don't know if it's because part of my last name is Venn, but I'm a huge fan of a good Venn diagram. And this one brings together, the questions are, what is the work that needs to be done? What are the skills or assets that you can bring to that work? And what brings you joy? And that the work that you should do is what sits at the intersection, again, of those different pieces. And again, I found this really powerful. This is something I learned about within the last couple of years, because I think sometimes those of us who are engaged in social and environmental justice issues, there's this sense that we need to do all the things. We need to solve all the problems. And then that can lead to overwhelm and burnout and all kinds of other things. But to find that piece, and I would say start with what brings you joy, and then figure out kind of how to piece that together. So again, it's what is the work that needs to be done? What are the skills that you bring to that work? And what brings you joy? Because I think if everybody approached the crises that we're up against in that way, it wouldn't mean that all of us are writing letters to our MPs all the time. It wouldn't mean that all of us are, sharing information on podcasts or other presentations. But it would mean that we are all doing those things to which we are best suited, where we find the most joy. And just by approaching the way that we live from that perspective, I think we won't be able to help ourselves by succeeding in meeting some of these challenges. So you don't need to do everything, and find a place where you can do something.
That's very good advice and on a lot of fronts. And thank you for reminding me. I appreciate it. Yeah, on the flip side, we talked in our earlier conversations also about some of the challenges that emerging leaders and activists are facing these days. And maybe you can say a little bit about, from your perspective as someone who's worked as a policy analyst in social and climate justice for 14 years. What are some of the challenges that you think we're facing right now, and especially with the emerging and leaders and activists in mind?
I think there's a couple of things, but again, like everything, it's connected. On the one hand, there's this sense that some of the challenges, in particular the climate crisis, is so big that there's nothing that we can do. And so there's this sense of impotence or doom that there's no way we can solve it. On the flip side, though, and I think these exist side by side, I think in a lot of ways, because there's been so much more awareness raised about the climate emergency and what needs to be done, and there have been important shifts in terms of government action, there's among some there's sort of this doom and gloom, and others there's this kind of complacency. It's like, okay, well, they know, they've named the problem, they've identified some solutions, they keep telling us about these unprecedented investments, and better targets than we've ever had and all of that. So surely we're okay. And so that also allows people to kind of let themselves off the hook. And those two pieces together get to this this tension that I think has been around, and it's not unique to climate justice, but in the climate justice space, kind of the relative merits of individual or collective action, and kind of this idea that we can all do all the things, go zero waste and stop eating meat and not drive and all of that, and yet it won't achieve the scale of change that we need. But what's interesting in that is that it's by doing those things, by setting that example, by working in relationship, that we begin to shift the public discourse and the sort of the narrative around what is possible and what is desirable. Because when we as a society start to say more fully, we want electric infrastructure, for example. We want policies that, make it more difficult to engage in these harmful activities and easier to engage in these more beneficial activities. Politicians, and this circles back to what we were talking about at the beginning. Politicians, in a lot of ways, are much more followers than they are leaders. At the end of the day, the policies and the programs and the initiatives that go through are those that political leaders believe they can gain support for.
Right.
So it's in some ways, I think it's a bit of a misnomer, because we do talk about, political leaders and some of them, it's like I said at the beginning, sometimes it's the role, but in terms of the practice piece, we all have agency as citizens and as residents of our society to sort of say, this is what works for me. And it's a slow tide, right? Like, we know that there are a lot of people that are really passionate about this, and it's often the mushy middle that we really need to work to sort of wake from that complacency that I mentioned earlier, so that we can kind of build the energy towards the kind of change we need.
So that actually is a good lead up to my final question, because we're coming close to the time where we open the floor to questions from our audience. You've worked as a policy analyst now for some time, and in the context of what you're talking about in terms of these tensions that leaders and activists can live as they're pursuing social and climate justice. Also, the overwhelm, the heaviness that you can feel sometimes when you look at all the things that need to be done, and you're just one person or a small group of people, an organization. There can be a sense that working on policy may or may not play the substantive role that it once did. So my question is, as you transition out of this role as a policy analyst, what role does policy continue to have, or do you feel that it continues to have as we confront pressing issues such as climate change and environmental degradation?
I think that my move out of day-to-day public policy is in no way reflective of a shift in belief in terms of the value. It's the policies that are made that shape kind of the rules that govern the society that we live in and how we move forward. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if I end up kind of engaging in other elements of climate policy in different ways, just because I feel like it's part of who I am. But I think that I think too often it can be made to seem as this dry, you don't really have to worry about it kind of piece off to the side, that really is, as I said before, kind of fundamental in shaping how how society is run and what the, you know, the rules and the, maybe not even, I mean, it does shape the rules, but sort of the norms and what's considered, you know, appropriate behavior in a particular context. So I think, and I think I want to reemphasize as well that all of this happens in relationship, that it can be construed as sort of this academic, or, you know, it's civil servants kind of in a often a dark corner kind of bringing this stuff together, but it's all shaped by and continues to shape the relationship between individuals, between different communities, between different areas, whether it's, you know, energy and agriculture and, you know, transportation, and how all these pieces fit together. And I think that relational aspect of it is also really important.
So it sounds like you still have hope.
Yeah, and though I've heard some interesting analyses, or, you know, because hope sometimes gets a bad rap as sort of this Pollyanna-ish kind of idea. But I think in a lot of ways, hope is fed by action, right? It's what we do in our day-to-day, and this, you know, it's the conversations we have with our children and our colleagues, and the decisions that we make. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Karri.
Welcome.
I'm sure we can talk much more, and I'm sure people have questions that they'd like to ask Karri as well. So I'll turn the floor back to Bianca.
Thank you very much. It was such a wonderful conversation. I was taking a lot of notes, and it's been very inspiring for me. So I invite you now to ask your questions. You can either put up the virtual hand or your real hand, or write your question in the chat if you prefer. So Joe, please.
I couldn't resist a question to these two wonderful women leaders. And the question is, from both of your experience, but especially Karri, you know, the political world is sometimes seen as very male, very politics, you confront people, but your reflections on gender, the ability to communicate, the kind of experience that you and perhaps Lauren too have had. And as you're thinking about that, one of the most amazing stories that I keep coming back to, Karri, you've engaged with people like Kirsty Duncan and Deb Schultz. But I remember when Deb Schultz was just recently elected as a member of Parliament and the chair of the Environment Committee, and we had a meeting with her. And you may recall, for me, it was one of those incredible moments. You were engaging with her, and at one point, this politician talked about her son. She said he's off in Nova Scotia at school. He wants to be an oceanographer, but he called me to say, "Mom, I've decided I'm going to quit." And she said, "Well, why? This is what you've always wanted to do." And he said, "Well, I've come to the understanding through my studies that all of the large creatures that live in the sea are finished. They have a timeline. We're destroying it all. And why would I spend my life studying this if there's going to be nothing left?" And this politician telling us that story, remember, she broke down in tears, eh? So I think there's something about that ability to connect. There's some gender, those wonderful women leaders, and the kind of there's a whole different way of engagement that you probably have reflections about that I think would be very, very helpful. Women in leadership is so key.
Thank you.
Well, it's interesting. I do remember that conversation, Joe, and it was quite moving. And I think fundamentally, I think it has to do with sort of a way that we continue to socialize, that we have been socialized, and that I think we're working to shift, but where it's perceived as more acceptable for women to be vulnerable or to show emotion. And I think that lifting up those moments, I think, is really important, and recognizing the value in that, because that's an example where I think it was you and I, our intern, who was also a young woman, and this female MP, that were having that conversation. But I would love to see a situation where, it was a group of men and there was that same permission for vulnerability in the room, because I think that is really important. At the same time, the other piece that comes to mind, as you know, and some others might as well, when Catherine McKenna, when she was a newly elected MP, even right before the election, she was at an event that we had hosted. I remember, and I used to bike through what was her riding to get to the office, and her picture was, and I said to her, I know you, how do we, and we did that kind of, and it was interesting because, again, when I talk about sort of power and leadership and sort of positions, at that point, she was just an electoral candidate. She didn't have a cabinet post. She didn't have, an international profile, or, I guess she did in a different way, but not like, and it was funny because we realized in that moment, standing on the street in front of Parliament Hill, that we had done mom and baby classes together when our then young teenagers were not even toddlers. But there too, it was like, so one of the things that we had in common, and that I always held in the back of my mind through all of the meetings that I had with her over the years, was that she was a mom just like me. And I think, and this can go to not just the way that women relate to one another, but again, I think I would love to see if we could live into a space where we all look for what are those pieces that we have in common. And because that for me was when I think a big shift came in terms of these are all just people doing their things. Like up until that point, I didn't have necessarily a connection, or at least not one that I knew about, with previous environment ministers or social development ministers. And it's interesting because even with the current environment minister, I'm waiting, I got a call back from his office and I'm waiting for the next one. But what was interesting was in engaging with him, I was able to make reference to an event that he and I did together at St. Paul University after the signing of the Paris Agreement. I think, Gabrielle, you were involved in organizing that. Because again, it's, and essentially pointing to that event is about pointing to, this is something, not just a shared experience, but because of that engagement, I know that he knows what needs to be done. And I think sometimes the leadership that is required in social and environmental justice circles comes from being able to kind of create the permission, or the phrase is escaping right now, but like the social license to make bolder commitments and to take bolder action. So, I think there is an interesting thing because we do have more women in leadership now and more women in political leadership. But my personal belief is that we will get further by reimagining what we expect of our male colleagues. And that will actually allow people to kind of come up. Interestingly enough, in my wearing my other hat, I'm doing a women in agriculture event next month, because I've moved into a field that is even more male dominated. And it's interesting to see some of the challenges, but not even so much challenges, just preconceptions. And so I think it's a work in progress all across the board. But I've gone on a long time. Lauren, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
I don't want to add much because I know that there's probably people who have questions for you, Karri. I'll just say that I think that it just makes me think about the idea that you spoke about so eloquently around this idea of relationship and the relational spaces that we create for each other in our work, volunteer, activist lives, and how that can be a catalyst for for important conversations, but also can be the platform for making these bold commitments and statements about what needs to be done with regard to social justice and environmental justice. But I'm going to bring the questions back to the floor, and if anyone else has any questions for Karri, please go ahead.
I was wondering if I can ask a question myself, but I don't want to take over. So if there is a space for that, I really appreciated the way you were talking about the cultivation of awe, wonder, and love as sources for us to ground ourselves as we engage in this work that can sometimes be really challenging. And I'm wondering, in your work, if you can give us an example of a certain policy, for example, that was giving hope to people and that you see as really hopeful, that was, I would say, bringing to fruition some of your efforts in advocacy. So I'm just curious if there is such, if there is an example that you could tell us.
It's amazing to me how the mind works, because the first thing that came to mind is actually outside of the scope of federal public policy, but there was a fascinating moment last November during the UN climate talks in Glasgow, Scotland, where for the first time in the context, sort of in the 21 COPs or Conference of Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where they talked about oil and gas. And it's interesting because this isn't necessarily about sort of an awe and wonder piece so much as it was about naming a reality. So in the preceding, like I said, I don't know why I said 21, in the preceding 25 meetings, in 25, 26 years, in all of the international climate negotiations, they had never mentioned in their decision text oil and gas. And it was interesting because it actually reminds me of another meeting that I had with the now Minister of Immigration, but Sean Fraser previously was Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. And I remember he had admittedly left the room, but I was speaking with one of his staff people who was trying to convince me and a few others who were there talking about climate policy, about all the good things that the federal government has done. And he said to me, well, setting oil and gas aside, and then I can't remember what point he tried to make, because I was having none of it, because that's kind of fundamentally what Canada and what the global community have done in the climate space, is to say, well, we won't talk about oil and gas, even though it's the largest source of emissions, but we will talk about everything else. So to get to a point, even though in some ways it was absurd that it had taken so long, where our global leaders were effectively naming the fullness, in a sense, of the problem, to me, that was an exciting and hopeful moment. I mean, it was a whole bunch of things, so it's hard to sort of stick a specific label on it, but it was, I think the hopefulness comes in it was just so necessary that be done. And it would have been way better if it had happened, at COP1 instead of at COP26, but that we arrived, I think, was good.
Thank you for that. So would it be okay to have one last question? We have 2-3 more minutes. If someone else would like to. Comment or offer a question. Ruth?
Yeah, probably just more of a comment than a question. first off, thank you very much. I'm not sure what I was doing browsing around last week on the St. Paul website and saw this. I just took a course in the winter semester with Professor Levesque, followed that up with one out of the St. Andrews College in Saskatoon on ecumenical, interreligious, and interfaith dialogue. And anyway, all of this connections and the streams, how things all run together, and you find a home. I find I'm always just hungry to learn more and kind of expand my knowledge. Still not sure where I'm going. I'm a student in the MDiv program at St. Paul and very nearing the end of that. So thank you for introducing me to the Citizens of Public Justice. Joe, I believe, was a speaker last year. I did the Truth and Reconciliation, the course that Professor Andreos did, and I believe seeing Joe Gunn here this morning, I recognized him as a speaker, Professor Samaria as well. You just continue to connect dots and feed, and I'm going to be 60 this year. It's exciting for me to my worldview expanded in this way, that I'm hungry for it and I don't know where I'm going to go to do something about it, but I do believe my faith and my spirituality will play a big piece in it. So that was not really a question, but a huge thank you for, this should have been packed with many people. It is recorded, and are these and your prior ones that you've done, are they up on the website somewhere on St. Paul?
Gabrielle, do you want to answer that, or should I answer
that? All the previous Being a Leader are available on the Providence School YouTube channel, which I'll re-put the link in the chat.
Okay, I saw that before. Thank you, Gabrielle. Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Ruth. And if I could just, in the theme of making connections, Joe was actually the executive director at CPJ for over a decade. Well, no, it's good that you were there because that's how I got there. But yeah, and I should also say, I'm glad that you spoke up. I realized a long time ago that my resting face is kind of stern. And when I do public presentations, when I did them in public, there was usually at least one person that was fairly close to the front and usually smiling. And Ruth, you were that person for me today. So thank you for, it always makes it a little easier when there seems to be at least one person smiling and nodding as we go along. So, I mean, you've all been fantastic, but I did notice you, Ruth, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Karri, for being with us today. It was a really fascinating interview, and thank you, Lauren, for your amazing questions as well. I learned a lot of things, and I appreciated how you connected so many things, relating back to what Ruth was sharing. So this idea of interconnectedness of various things in our experience. So I would like to mention that we will not have Being a Leader events until the fall. So we will take a break over the summer, but in the last week of August, we will have an event from our Activating the Heart in Higher Education project. So there will be an in-person event where we will work with somatic transformation in the learning process. So we will engage our bodies, and we will talk about these embodied emotional aspects of learning. So I want to thank you for all of those who participated today. Thank you for your time and attention and generosity. And last, I want to mention that admissions for September 2022 for our graduate programs are still open, but just until June 30th. So we are in the last week of being still open for applications. So please consider sharing this information with emerging or established leaders in your networks or people who may be interested. So we want to thank you again, everyone, and we will send you the recording of this event, and we hope to stay in touch with you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Karri.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.